Welcome to Isabella True Crime Meaning Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I sat on the porch of the old house where once everything had seemed so familiar and cozy, but now everything was different. My husband Theodore had left for a business trip, and I was left alone. The evening from yesterday still lingered in the air. His footsteps, his voice, his laughter, all had faded, dissolved into emptiness on the table. Only a glass of wine remained, swaying gently from the light breeze that rustled the leaves of the old trees. The lights from the neighboring house flickered in the distance, but I felt neither comfort nor peace. I took a sip, trying to nestle into this moment of solitude. The rain softly tapped on the roof, creating a sense of some elusive stability. Strange. But in this moment, instead of feeling freedom, I was overwhelmed by something opposite anxiety. Something in the air felt foreign. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was me. The last few months had left me on the edge of exhaustion. Theodore, as always, was absorbed in work, and I seemed to only play the role of a backdrop in his life. There were times when I wondered if I was losing myself in the role of wife in the familiar rhythm of days. Everything had become monotonous. I couldn't even remember the last time I took a break from all this routine today. Alone with myself, I finally felt how my shoulders relaxed, how all the tension crawled out of me. But then came the thought that solitude was not what I needed in this moment of silence. It was as if I felt the emptiness consuming me, and this sensation left a strange aftertaste on my lips. I closed my eyes to rid myself of the intrusive thoughts, and suddenly, I flinched uncertainly. The door creaked and I opened my eyes, expecting to see just another drop of rain which had started falling harder. But no, it was something else, someone's footsteps. I can't say I was scared. More likely anxiety overtook me, as though there was someone inside the house. Although that was impossible, we were alone here. I quickly got up, unable to shake the feeling that something was happening beyond my perception, something important and inevitable. I hurried into the house anxiously, scanning every corner. But as soon as I stepped through the threshold, I saw him. The one who made me freeze. My gaze met his, and for a moment my heart stopped. Oliver. My stepson stood in the doorway. He was here. Although I distinctly remembered that he had left for school yesterday, we hadn't expected his return, and there was no reason for him to come back so early. There was something new in his tired eyes, tension as if his own life had somehow broken and he didn't know how to fix it. I froze. I couldn't look away from his figure. He looked just a little older than the last time I saw him, and in that gaze there was something unsettling, as though he hadn't just come to visit his father but had come to a house that was something more than just a place to sleep. "Did you come back?" I finally breathed out, trying to cover up my own confusion. I didn't even understand why that word sounded so strange, as though I wasn't just talking about his return, but somehow trying to find out what had brought him here. He nodded slightly without saying a word. The only thing I noticed was how his gaze slid over me, evaluating, as if he was searching for something in this house that I couldn't understand. "Theodore's not here," I said, feeling as though this fact stripped away any foundation beneath me. I felt alone again, even though he was here, but even his presence didn't offer me any comfort. On the contrary, it created a heaviness that didn't quite fit. Oliver didn't respond. He simply walked past me and headed into the living room as if this were his home, not mine. I stood there trying to justify my feelings, to understand why something strange overcame me. When I saw him, he was just a kid. But his adult mannerisms, his eyes full of unspoken things, made me feel a ridiculous sense that everything had changed in that moment. Maybe it was just his energy which seemed too powerful for this house, for this evening, for everything around me. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to restore some normality to this encounter, but it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a plea, as though I already knew the answer. It was something more than just trying to understand his behavior. I felt that he was the one who might awaken something unconscious in me, something long forgotten. He turned to face me, and I immediately realized everything that had happened before no longer mattered. I couldn't just put everything back into place. The room filled with unbearable silence. We stood facing each other, and despite the distance of just a few steps, it felt as though there was an invisible wall between us, one that was impossible to cross. Oliver took off his jacket and carefully hung it over the back of a chair, and I noticed how he watched every move I made. His eyes never left me, as if he was trying to understand what was going on inside, and suddenly I realized he saw me in a way that was completely different from how he usually did. I felt a strange tension in the air, as if something important, something inexpressible, was beginning to build up in that moment. It was as though the room itself had become cramped and our conversation had become unreal. We both knew we couldn't return to our usual state, that some boundary had already been crossed. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't help feeling how something inside me responded to his presence. He noticed my glass of wine and his gaze became a little heavier. I felt how his eyes paused as though he were trying to understand something, perhaps both in himself and in me. It was a strange sensation, being so visible yet feeling as though I were lost. "Alien. You've changed," he suddenly said, and his voice was so confident that it made me want to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. It wasn't just an observation. It was a question. Though unspoken, he could see that something was happening to me and that something was now between us in every glance. In every moment. I felt his words touch me. I stood there, not knowing what to say, and tried to smile, but the smile came out stiff, unnatural. "I don't know what you mean." I breathed out, but my voice trembled, betraying me. He remained silent, continuing to watch me, and in that silence, I realized he wasn't expecting an answer from me. He was simply waiting to see what I would do next. The silence that lay between us was growing heavy. It filled every corner of the room, as if it already owned us. I could feel his gaze penetrating through me again. I couldn't say what troubled me more, his intense attention, or how I myself had started to respond to it. Oliver took a step closer, and suddenly everything fell into place, not in the sense of right or wrong, but in the sense that I felt his presence so clearly that I couldn't forget it. His closeness seemed to awaken something in me that I had long been trying not to notice, not to think about. His gaze was both tender and persistent. He knew that I couldn't hide my feelings anymore, and it seemed like he knew that those feelings would decide what would happen next. I couldn't believe this was happening, and yet I couldn't look away. I didn't even notice how his steps had become so close that the space between us vanished and all that remained was his breath mixed with mine. His eyes were unwavering and I could feel how his gaze pierced through me as if trying to see everything I was hiding, everything I hadn't dared admit to myself. I stood there, not knowing what to do, and instead of retreating, something in my body seemed to respond to his presence. He stepped even closer, and I instinctively closed my eyes as if that would somehow block his persistence, his closeness, which was becoming more and more palpable. But when I opened my eyes, he was so close that I could feel his warmth, his shadow. In that moment all I could hear was the loud beating of my own heart, and then, as if in slow motion, it happened. His lips touched mine. It was quick, unintentional, yet so undeniable. I didn't know what it was, didn't understand how it could have happened, but in that moment it felt like everything around me ceased to exist. All that mattered was Oliver, his lips, his touch, his breath. It didn't matter who we were to each other, what had happened before, or what would happen next. In that moment there was nothing but the three of us. I pulled away as if I had been struck by electricity. We both froze, stunned, confused. It wasn't desire. It wasn't a deliberate decision. It was a mistake that no one could explain. I turned away trying to figure out how to get out of this situation, what to say, what to do. But there were no thoughts in my head, no words. All I felt was the irreversibility of that moment. I could feel something inside me turning, and in that turn there was nothing simple. It wasn't just an impulsive action. It was something more complex, tangled, painfully real. It was not that I said, trying to justify myself, but not believing my own words. I didn't know what it had been, but inside me, the comfort and certainty that had been there before were gone. I couldn't push his image, his touch out of my mind. It couldn't just have been a mistake. It was something much bigger. He didn't say anything. His silence was even heavier. I could feel him watching me, but I couldn't understand what he was thinking. Maybe he didn't know either what to do with what had just happened. The silence once again filled the room, becoming even thicker than before. I knew this moment couldn't be erased, and I couldn't understand what to do with this new feeling that seemed to have awoken, leaving me restless. Morning came too early. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts swirled, restless, and every movement. Every task seemed pointless and meaningless. The house was silent, but it was a silence that felt ominous, almost suffocating. I avoided his gaze as if in it lay all my weakness. Yesterday. Evening still lingered in the air, and even though I tried to imagine myself in the role of a regular wife, everything inside me had already been disturbed. I busied myself with tasks that didn't require much attention. I washed the dishes, rearranged books on the shelves, though it made no sense. I needed to do something to put everything back in place, even though I knew that was impossible. This house, this space, even my own reflection in the mirror. Everything seemed foreign and unfamiliar. I couldn't drown out the feeling that something important had disappeared, and now everything was spoiled. Oliver appeared from time to time, but I avoided interacting with him when he said something. I responded as neutral as possible, as if trying to hide everything that was happening inside. Every word from him sparked something in me and I tried not to show it. It was a tortuous process, forcing myself to act as I had before, when everything was simpler and clearer. One evening I found myself in the kitchen again, cleaning up after dinner, and once again I heard his footsteps behind me. My stomach tightened and I felt the tension grip me again. He stopped beside me, silently watching me. I picked up a cup as if it might help me not think about what I was feeling. "I thought you wouldn't respond to me anymore," he said, his voice calm, but there was something else in it, subtle yet persistent. I raised my gaze and met his eyes. They were full of something unclear. The same thing I had been trying to avoid. It was pain, a mixture of regret, and something more, something we couldn't control. "I don't want all of this to destroy us," I replied, but the words felt hollow. I didn't know what I meant. I didn't know what exactly I didn't want to destroy. I couldn't even understand what was important to me, what was worth preserving. He was silent, and in his silence there was so much that I couldn't find the words to express my feelings. He didn't condemn me. He didn't accuse me. He was just there, as if he knew that words couldn't fix everything, and I lacked the courage to uncover what I truly felt. I couldn't tell the truth because I feared it would destroy what we had, if we had anything left at all. In that moment I realized that I couldn't run from the truth anymore, whatever it was. But as long as I couldn't find the strength to admit to myself what was really happening between us, I continued to mask it under a semblance of normalcy. That evening I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, trying to focus on the familiar movements that required minimal attention. But there was nothing in my mind except the image of Oliver, his gaze, his presence. Every word, every gesture from him seemed to pierce me, making me feel like I no longer had control over what was happening inside. And then he appeared again, quietly, almost imperceptibly, as usual. I didn't realize he was standing behind me until I heard his voice, which, despite its calm tone, sounded like a challenge. "You've been avoiding me again," he said. And in those words, there was so much understanding that it struck me. He wasn't being aggressive, he wasn't trying to accuse me, but I felt that he wasn't just noticing my distance. He felt how it was growing between us. I stopped, unsure of what to say, and his voice was not condemnation, but something much more complex, a desire to understand. He wasn't asking why I was avoiding him. He was simply acknowledging it. But it was hard for me to accept because I couldn't explain to myself what was really happening. "Don't know what to do." I exhaled, gripping the knife in my hands. I wanted to retreat, avoid this conversation as I always did, but I knew I couldn't do that. I was already standing on the edge and there was no point in hiding. He remained silent for a few moments. His gaze deep, penetrating, as if he were trying to find an answer in my soul. He didn't rush me, didn't try to force an answer. Instead, he said something that made me freeze. "I feel like something's changed, you've changed, and this isn't just a coincidence. Can you admit that?" he asked. And I felt a wave of uncertainty and fear wash over me. I couldn't say that all of this didn't matter. I couldn't justify it. To myself, the silence stretched on, and in it, I began to feel the rising tension, as if this unspoken weight had filled all the space between us. His words were penetrating, touching the deepest corners of my soul, and at the same time, I knew I couldn't admit what was really happening. I couldn't allow myself to. "Yes," I said quietly, feeling that this word was an admission of something much bigger than just an explanation. It was ANC acknowledgement of what I felt but couldn't accept, of what I couldn't understand, and in that admission was something painfully clear that I couldn't push away. Oliver noticed it and his gaze softened, but the tension didn't disappear. I felt that he knew more than I could grasp, and perhaps that was what scared me the most. His ability to see me for who I really was without the embellishments and defensive masks. "You're not alone in this," he said, and his voice was unexpectedly quiet, almost thoughtful. "I feel like everything has changed too." These words turned everything inside me upside down. I didn't know how to react. He was right. We both knew that something important had happened, and that something was so powerful that I couldn't pretend everything was as it was before. A few days passed and nothing had changed between us except that I found myself thinking about him more often about Oliver. His presence had become so familiar that I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze and his words had penetrated every corner of my world. And although I kept pretending that everything was fine, it wasn't the same as before. The tension grew like a lump in my throat, making it hard to breathe calmly. Every time we met eyes, it seemed that words were unnecessary. We both understood that there was nothing left to hide. That invisible wall which used to stand between us had vanished, and I didn't know how to cope with it. With each encounter it became clearer. We both knew we couldn't put everything back in place. One day, sitting on the porch, I once again caught myself thinking about him, about what would have happened if things had been different. I lit a cigarette and picked up a cup of cold tea, but the thoughts wouldn't let me be. What if? This question replayed in my mind over and over, even though I knew I couldn't find an answer. The wind was tearing the leaves from the trees and I thought, like me, they were being carried somewhere, unable to stay in one place. And then I heard footsteps. I didn't turn, but I felt his presence immediately. He was close. I couldn't help but notice how he perhaps was trying to hide his thoughts just like I was. But I knew that between us there was something more than just silence. Have you ever wondered how your life could have turned out differently? He said. And I felt how his words pierced me. He looked at me so intently that my head started to spin. It was a question that didn't just make me think, but penetrated deep into my heart. I felt that lump in my throat. Again he spoke about it as if he knew that this question could destroy everything. But I couldn't answer because in truth I didn't know what I would choose. If I could go back. I thought about it. Could I have done something differently? Were there moments when I could have changed my life, my decisions? He kept looking at me, his gaze persistent, almost painful. And in his eyes I saw something that made me forget about time. Forget about everything else. It wasn't just a question about the past. It was a question about what was between us. We were standing on the threshold of something I couldn't explain, but felt in every nerve. And no matter how hard I tried to distance myself, no matter how much I tried to run from this thought, I knew it wouldn't go away. Do you think about it too? He asked. And there was something in his voice that made me shudder. It was so natural that it scared me. Could it be that I wasn't alone in this? Could it be that he was feeling the same things I was trying to hide? I didn't answer. I just sat there looking into his eyes, and it seemed for a moment everything around us disappeared. Only us, only that question and the feeling that was between us. If you found our journey impactful, please like, subscribe and activate the notification bell to never miss another story of unbelievable resilience. Thanks.